In March 1944, a British mechanic named Thomas Harwell made an unauthorized modification to a P-47 Thunderbolt's gun synchronization system at RAF Bodny. What his superiors dismissed as tinkering would become the technical foundation for one of the most devastating ground attack aircraft of the European theater. But the path from workshop rebellion to battlefield legend was paved with bureaucratic resistance, tactical skepticism, and the kind of engineering intuition that only comes from those who work with steel and oil rather than paper and protocol. This is the story of how a single adjustment, born from frustration, refined in silence and proven in blood, transformed the P-47 from escort fighter into armored killer. It begins not with heroism, but with a wrench, a stopwatch, and the quiet certainty of a man who knew the machine better than those who flew it. The modification itself was deceptively simple. Harwell had noticed that the standard gun convergence pattern for the P-47's 8.50 caliber machine guns was optimized for air-to-air combat at 300 yards. A distance that made sense when engaging Messerschmitts at altitude, but produced catastrophic scatter patterns during low-altitude strafing runs against German armor. The guns, mounted in the wings with slight outward angles, created a cone of fire that expanded rapidly below 200 feet. Against tanks and half-tracks moving at ground level, this meant that only 2 or 3 rounds per burst actually struck the target, while the rest carved harmless furrows in French soil. Harwell's adjustment tightened the convergence to 150 yards and added a 3-degree downward cant to the outer gun mounts, a modification that required recalibrating the firing mechanism timing and adjusting the ammunition feed angles by fractions of an inch. He made the changes during a routine maintenance cycle, working through the night in the unheated hangar while the pilot roster slept. No authorization, no documentation. Just the methodical precision of a man who had spent 2 decades in aircraft factories and knew that the difference between accuracy and waste often came down to angles measured in degrees you could count on one hand. When the pilot, Lieutenant James Colfax of the 56th Fighter Group, returned to his aircraft the following morning, Harwell said nothing. There was no reason to complicate a simple improvement with explanations that would require forms, approvals, and the inevitable resistance of men who confused procedure with competence. The first test came accidentally. Colfax was escorting a bomber formation near St. Lo when his squadron was diverted to provide ground support for a pinned infantry unit. German Panzer IVs had established positions along a hedgerow, and the weather was too poor for dive bombers. Colfax dropped to 800 feet and opened fire on the lead tank from a shallow angle, expecting the usual light show of sparks and ricochets. Instead, the concentrated stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds punched through the engine deck plating in a tight cluster. The tank didn't explode dramatically. It simply stopped, smoke rising from the punctured compartment as the crew abandoned the vehicle. Colfax made 2 more passes. 2 more tanks disabled. The pattern held. Back at Bodny, Colfax reported the unusual effectiveness to his squadron commander, Major Robert Landry. Landry was skeptical. The P-47 was designed as a high-altitude interceptor, and the idea that minor gun adjustments could transform it into an effective tank killer seemed improbable. But the gun camera footage was undeniable. The impact patterns showed a concentration density that shouldn't have been possible with standard convergence settings. Landry ordered an inspection. Within an hour, Harwell was standing in the operations office, explaining modifications he had made without permission to an aircraft he wasn't authorized to alter. The room went quiet. Landry had 2 options: discipline the mechanic for violating protocol, or test whether the unauthorized adjustment could be replicated. He chose the latter. Over the next week, Harwell modified 6 more P-47s in the squadron, each time documenting the precise measurements and timing adjustments. The pilots flew controlled ground attack exercises against abandoned German equipment captured near Caen. The results were consistent. Effective engagement range increased by 40%, ammunition efficiency improved by 60%, and the concentration of fire at 150 yards was sufficient to penetrate the rear armor of medium tanks and the side plating of heavier models. The P-47, designed to fight at 20,000 feet, had become a ground support weapon capable of surgical strikes against armored columns, not through new technology, but through understanding the geometry of violence at low altitude. Yet the breakthrough carried a moral weight that Harwell could not ignore. In the workshop, surrounded by hydraulic lines and ammunition belts, he was solving an engineering problem. But each adjustment he made translated directly into burning metal and broken bodies on French roads. The pilots spoke of disabled tanks with clinical satisfaction. Harwell thought of the German mechanics who had built those tanks, men like himself, working night shifts in factories, calibrating systems they hoped would protect the soldiers inside. The war demanded efficiency. His hands delivered it. But the steel did not care about the intentions of those who shaped it, and the accuracy he created was measured in lives ended with mathematical precision. The P-47 was never meant to hunt armor. But in war, what a machine was meant to do and what it must do are separated by the width of a wrench and the will of those who refuse to accept limitations written by men who never touched the steel. The technical briefing took place in a converted barn 2 miles from the airfield, where Major Landry assembled 12 pilots and presented them with something that should not have existed. Empirical proof that improper modifications improve performance. The room smelled of aviation fuel and damp wood. On a makeshift chalkboard, Harwell had drawn the convergence patterns, the standard configuration, spreading rounds across a 20-foot diameter at ground level, his adjustment concentrating them into a 6-foot circle. The mathematics was simple. The implications were not. If unauthorized changes by a single mechanic could increase lethality by this magnitude, what else had been overlooked in the rush to industrialize air combat? What other assumptions, encoded in technical manuals written by engineers who never flew combat missions, were quietly killing Allied soldiers through institutional inertia? Lieutenant Colfax spoke first. He described the engagement near St. Lo with the precision of someone translating violence into vocabulary. The angle of approach. The trigger discipline required to maintain fire within the optimal envelope. The way the armor-piercing rounds behaved differently when concentrated, not punching single holes, but creating stress fractures that propagated through the plating like controlled demolition. He had flown 62 combat missions. He had strafed German positions dozens of times. But until Harwell's modification, he had never felt the aircraft respond as an extension of intent rather than a compromise between design and necessity. The P-47 had become something its creators never imagined. Not through innovation, but through correction of an error no one had noticed because no one had asked the right questions. The squadron began systematic testing. They flew against captured Panzer IIIs and IVs positioned in open fields, measuring penetration depth, hit probability, and ammunition consumption per disabled vehicle. The data accumulated with brutal clarity. Standard convergence required an average of 400 rounds to achieve mission kill against medium armor. Harwell's adjustment reduced it to 180. The implications cascaded through every level of tactical planning. Ammunition loads could be reduced, extending range. Pilots could engage multiple targets per sortie. The risk exposure time, those seconds when the aircraft flew straight and level, vulnerable to ground fire, was cut by more than half. What had begun as mechanical intuition was becoming doctrine, though no manual would acknowledge it, and no procurement officer would authorize it. But the breakthrough attracted attention that Harwell neither wanted nor welcomed. By mid-April, representatives from the 8th Air Force Technical Section arrived at Bodney to inspect the modifications and interview the mechanic who had made them. Captain Theodore Marsh was a West Point graduate with a degree in aeronautical engineering from MIT, precisely the kind of credentialed authority that Harwell had spent his career quietly outperforming. Marsh examined the adjusted gun mounts with the skepticism of someone trained to distrust solutions that hadn't emerged from proper channels. He measured the angles, reviewed the firing tests, questioned whether the improvements were real or statistical anomaly. Then he asked the question that revealed the true nature of institutional resistance. Why wasn't this adjustment proposed through official technical review? Harwell's answer was delivered without emotion or apology. Because official technical review required 16 weeks minimum processing time, during which thousands of sorties would be flown with suboptimal configurations. Because the review board consisted of officers who evaluated proposals based on credentials and documentation rather than functional testing. Because the system rewarded caution over results, and the only way to prove the modification worked was to implement it and let the steel speak for itself. Marsh listened with the expression of someone receiving information that confirmed his worst suspicions about the disorder of field operations. He recommended that all unauthorized modifications be reversed pending formal evaluation. Major Landry declined. The squadron would continue flying with Harwell's adjustments until ordered otherwise by someone willing to explain to infantry commanders why air support had become less effective. The tension reflected a deeper conflict that ran through every theater of the war. The collision between engineering principles developed in peacetime laboratories and tactical realities discovered in combat. The P-47 had been designed by brilliant engineers working from specifications that prioritized high-altitude performance, structural integrity, and mass production efficiency. But those engineers had never flown ground attack missions over Normandy. They had never felt the aircraft shudder as rounds scattered uselessly across hardened earth. They had never watched infantry die because air support lacked the precision to strike targets 30 yards from friendly positions. Harwell's crime was not technical incompetence. It was solving a problem that institutional procedure had declared didn't exist, using methods that threatened the authority of those whose expertise was measured in degrees rather than results. The moral weight of the situation settled on Harwell with the persistence of oil stains. He had made aircraft more effective at killing. The pilots celebrated. The infantry commanders requested more modified P-47s. The official channels remained silent, neither approving nor condemning, letting battlefield results create facts that bureaucracy would eventually be forced to acknowledge. But in the quiet hours of the workshop, Harwell thought about the German tank crews, boys conscripted from farms and factories, trained just enough to operate machinery they barely understood, sent to die in steel boxes that men like himself had taught Allied pilots to open with surgical precision. The war would be won. The modifications would be credited to institutional innovation. And the mechanics on both sides would return to their workshops, carrying the knowledge that their competence had been weaponized in ways that no technical manual could capture. Efficiency in war is measured in lives saved and lives taken. The steel doesn't distinguish, neither does the geometry. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested in knowing how far and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. By May 1944, 18 P-47 squadrons across 3 fighter groups had quietly adopted Harwell's convergence modifications. The change spread not through official directive, but through the informal network that connected maintenance crews. A conversation in a supply depot, a sketch on the back of a requisition form, a demonstration during a cross-base inspection. The modification required no special tools, no rare components, no additional training beyond what any competent armorer already possessed. It was the kind of improvement that revealed institutional failure through its very simplicity. If one mechanic working night shifts could increase aircraft lethality by this magnitude, how many other optimizations were being suppressed by procedural inertia? How many soldiers were dying because the system valued documentation over innovation? The tactical impact became undeniable during Operation Overlord. As Allied forces pushed inland from the Normandy beaches, German armored divisions attempted to establish defensive positions along the bocage, the dense hedgerow country that turned every field into a potential kill zone. Traditional air support struggled in this environment. Dive bombers required clear sight lines and stable weather. Heavy bombers couldn't distinguish targets at close range. But the modified P-47s, flying low and fast with concentrated firepower, could engage armor in the narrow lanes between hedgerows with accuracy that previously required direct artillery fire. Between June 6th and June 30th, P-47 squadrons flying with Harwell's adjustments claimed 412 disabled or destroyed German armored vehicles, a rate 3 times higher than squadrons using standard configurations. The statistical evidence forced a reckoning. In early July, Colonel Harrison Webb of the 9th Air Force convened a technical assessment board at an auxiliary field near Cherbourg. The board included aeronautical engineers, fighter tactics instructors, and representatives from Republic Aviation, the company that manufactured the P-47. Also present was Thomas Harwell, summoned from Bodny to explain modifications that had become too widespread to ignore and too effective to condemn. The atmosphere in the briefing tent carried the particular tension of institutions confronting unauthorized success. The modification worked, which meant that official procedures had failed, which meant that someone's competence would be questioned, and someone's authority would be diminished. Republic Aviation's chief engineer, Marcus Hollings, opened with a technical critique. The downward cant added stress to the gun mounting brackets that hadn't been calculated in the original structural analysis. The modified convergence pattern created uneven barrel wear that could affect long-term reliability. The timing adjustments increased the risk of ammunition feed jams during sustained fire. Each objection was valid. Each objection was also irrelevant. Harwell responded not with counter-arguments, but with maintenance logs from 18 squadrons showing that structural failures had not increased, barrel replacements remained within normal parameters, and jam rates had actually decreased because the tighter convergence reduced vibration harmonics. The engineer had theory, the mechanic had data. The war did not care which credential was more impressive. Colonel Webb made the decision that battlefield commanders make when institutional loyalty conflicts with tactical necessity. He would not officially approve the modifications. That would require acknowledging that standard configurations were inadequate, which would raise questions about procurement oversight and design validation. But he would not order the modifications reversed. Instead, he issued a technical bulletin that permitted field-level adjustments to gun convergence settings based on operational requirements and maintenance crew discretion. The language was deliberately vague. It gave legal cover to what was already happening, while avoiding formal admission that an unauthorized mechanic had corrected a design flaw that credentialed engineers had missed. The war would be documented as a triumph of American industrial innovation. The truth would remain in maintenance logs that no historian would read. But Harwell understood what the decision meant. His adjustment would be implemented across hundreds of aircraft. Thousands of sorties would be flown with configurations he had developed. The concentrated firepower would disable tanks, destroy supply columns, and kill men whose only crime was serving the wrong nation at the wrong time in history. He had not invented a new weapon. He had simply made an existing weapon more efficient at its singular purpose. And efficiency, in the moral calculus of war, was measured in tons of destroyed metal and the silence that followed the last radio transmission from a burning tank. The pilots would receive medals, the squadrons would receive commendations, The mechanic would return to the workshop where the smell of gun oil and hydraulic fluid would remind him that precision is morally neutral, but its applications never are. The doctrine that emerged from Harwell's work was never formally written because writing it would have required acknowledging that doctrine had been wrong. Instead, it became embedded in the practical knowledge passed between maintenance crews, encoded in the muscle memory of armorers, who adjusted convergence angles by feel rather than measurement, preserved in the flight characteristics that pilots learned to trust without understanding the engineering that made them possible. This was how war actually functioned, not through the rational implementation of strategic plans, but through the accumulated corrections of those close enough to the machinery to see what the system refused to acknowledge. The steel learned. The institutions remained deliberately ignorant, and the distance between what worked and what was authorized remained exactly wide enough for men like Harwell to operate in the gap. They called it innovation when it succeeded, and insubordination when it was questioned. The steel knew only that it had been shaped to kill more efficiently. The rest was language that mechanics learned to ignore. The true measure of Harwell's modification became apparent not in victory reports, but in casualty statistics that no one wanted to examine too closely. By August 1944, German tank crews in the Western Theater had developed what their after-action reports called Thunderbolt panic, a recognition that P-47 attacks were no longer survivable through evasive maneuvers or reactive tactics. The concentrated fire pattern meant that once a pilot achieved firing position, the outcome was functionally predetermined. Tank commanders began abandoning vehicles at the first sound of approaching engines, preferring capture to the certainty of burning alive in steel that had become a coffin. The modification that improved Allied tactical effectiveness had simultaneously eliminated the margin for error that allowed enemy soldiers to survive mistakes. Precision killed more efficiently than volume ever could. Lieutenant Colfax flew his 73rd combat mission on August 15th, leading a flight of 4 P-47s against a German armored column retreating through the Falaise pocket. The mission brief was straightforward: interdict the withdrawal, disable as many vehicles as possible, prevent the formation from reaching defensive positions east of the Seine. The weather was clear. The visibility was unlimited. The German column was strung out along a single road with no cover and no air support. It was, in the clinical language of tactical assessment, a target-rich environment. What followed was not a battle, but an execution. 12 minutes of concentrated strafing runs that left 47 vehicles burning and approximately 200 German soldiers dead or wounded. Colfax returned to base, filed his report, and requested reassignment to transport duty. The request was denied. Colfax was an experienced combat pilot with confirmed kills and extensive ground attack experience. The 9th Air Force was preparing for the push into Germany, and trained pilots were irreplaceable assets. But something in Colfax had broken during the Falaise mission. Not his skill, not his courage, but his ability to maintain the psychological distance required to treat other humans as targets. He had seen men burning as they tried to escape vehicles that his gunfire had transformed into ovens. He had watched a teenage soldier, uniform on fire, run in circles until he collapsed. He had felt the aircraft respond with perfect mechanical efficiency as Harwell's modifications concentrated rounds exactly where he aimed them. The modification worked. That was the problem. It worked so well that it eliminated the comforting fiction that war was anything other than industrial-scale killing, refined through technical optimization. Harwell learned of Colfax's request through the maintenance network, the informal communication system that connected those who worked with machinery rather than commanded it. The news arrived without comment or judgment, just a statement of fact passed along during a routine inspection. But Harwell understood what it meant. The pilot, who had first demonstrated the modification's effectiveness, had been psychologically disabled by that same effectiveness. The adjustment that saved Allied lives by killing enemy soldiers more efficiently had destroyed the mental equilibrium that allowed a decent man to function in an indecent situation. This was the cost that never appeared in tactical assessments or victory reports. The moral injury inflicted not by trauma, but by competence, by the realization that one's skills had been perfected in the service of systematic destruction. The irony was not lost on Harwell. He had spent his career pursuing precision, the perfect angle, the optimal timing, the exact measurement that separated adequate performance from excellence. In peacetime, that precision built better engines, safer aircraft, machines that served rather than destroyed. But war had weaponized his competence, transformed his pursuit of technical perfection into a mechanism for more efficient killing. The pilots broke under the weight of what they did. The mechanics carried the knowledge of what they enabled, and the system that demanded both precision and psychological denial continued to function because most people could maintain the compartmentalization required to separate technical pride from moral consequence. Harwell could not. Every adjusted gun mount, every calibrated firing mechanism, every maintenance log entry represented lives ended with accuracy that he had personally enabled. By September 1944, the modification had been implemented across 37 fighter groups. The technical bulletins avoided crediting Harwell by name. Institutional documentation preferred to attribute innovations to field experience and operational testing rather than individual initiative that might imply systemic inadequacy. But the pilots knew, the maintenance crews knew, and in the quiet spaces between missions, when mechanics gathered to discuss technical problems and tactical results, Harwell's name was spoken with the particular respect reserved for those who had changed how war functioned without seeking recognition or reward. He had made the machine more lethal. That was his contribution. Whether it was also his crime was a question that the steel could not answer. The letters began arriving in October. Not official commendations or formal recognition, but personal correspondence from pilots who wanted to thank the mechanic whose work had saved their lives by making their aircraft more effective at taking others. The letters were sincere, grateful, and unbearable. They described missions where concentrated firepower had disabled German tanks before they could target Allied positions. They recounted incidents where the modification's accuracy had allowed strikes against enemy armor within 50 yards of friendly forces. They expressed gratitude for technical excellence that translated directly into survival. Harwell read each letter once and filed them in a drawer he never opened again. The steel had spoken, the pilots had listened, and the distance between mechanical precision and human consequence remained exactly as wide as the gap between intention and result. Accuracy is a virtue in engineering and a curse in conscience. The modification did exactly what it was designed to do. That was the problem. That was always the problem. The official record of Harwell's modification exists in scattered technical bulletins, maintenance logs, and after-action reports that carefully avoid attribution or analysis. The 9th Air Force Historical Division compiled combat statistics showing improved ground attack effectiveness beginning in May 1944, but the documentation attributes this to enhanced pilot training and refined tactical procedures, rather than mechanical modifications that contradicted approved configurations. Republic Aviation's engineering archives contain no reference to field adjustments of gun convergence patterns. The company's official history of P-47 development, published in 1947, credits the aircraft's ground attack success to robust airframe design and powerful armament, without mentioning that both required unauthorized correction to function as advertised. The institutional memory was selectively preserved, results documented, methods erased. Thomas Harwell returned to civilian life in March 1946. accepting a position at a Manchester aircraft factory where his wartime experience translated into supervisory responsibility and quiet respect from men who had also served and understood what was never discussed. He married in 1947, purchased a small house near the factory, and lived with the methodical routine of someone who had learned to separate what he knew from what he allowed himself to remember. His wife, Catherine, noticed that he never spoke about the war except in technical terms: the specifications of aircraft systems, the challenges of field maintenance, the shortage of proper tools and replacement parts. When their son asked about his father's service, Harwell described adjusting gun timing on fighter aircraft. He did not mention what those guns were used for or how his adjustments had made them more effective. The recognition came decades late, and in forms that revealed more about institutional discomfort than genuine acknowledgement. In 1963, a military aviation historian named Bernard Trellis published a technical analysis of P-47 ground attack effectiveness that included a footnote reference to field modifications of gun convergence patterns implemented by maintenance personnel in the European theatre. The footnote cited no names and provided no details, but it represented the first official acknowledgement that standard configurations had been inadequate. Trellis sent a copy of his book to Harwell with a letter requesting an interview. Harwell declined. The history had been written without his participation. Adding his voice now would not change the record. It would only force him to articulate things that were better left in the silence, where mechanics kept the truths that officers preferred not to document. If this story has surprised you, leave a like to help the channel. The clearest documentation of what actually happened exists not in military archives, but in personal correspondence between maintenance crew members who served together and remained in contact after the war. These letters, discovered in estate sales and donated collections, contain technical discussions that reveal the systematic implementation of Harwell's adjustments across multiple squadrons, the resistance from engineering authorities, and the quiet satisfaction of men who had corrected institutional failure through practical knowledge. One letter, dated August 1944, describes the look on the West Point engineer's face when field results proved that his textbook was wrong. And another, from October 1945, mentions Tommy's adjustment as shorthand requiring no explanation among those who had served. These documents will never be incorporated into official histories because they contradict the narrative that innovation flowed from institutional expertise rather than individual initiative. Harwell's son, Michael, discovered the letters from pilots only after his father's death in 1982. They were stored in a toolbox in the garage, underneath manuals for aircraft systems that had been obsolete for 30 years. Michael read them with the shock of someone discovering that a quiet parent had lived an entirely separate existence unknown to his family. The letters described missions where his father's work had meant the difference between success and failure, survival and death. They used language like brilliant and life-saving to describe technical modifications that his father had dismissed as routine maintenance. Michael contacted several of the letter writers who were still alive. They spoke of Thomas Harwell with reverence, not for heroism or sacrifice, but for competence applied in circumstances where competence directly determined who lived and who died. The mechanic had never mentioned any of this. The final documentation came in 1989 when the Royal Air Force Museum acquired Harwell's personal logbooks as part of a collection of wartime maintenance records. The logbooks contained detailed technical notes on gun convergence adjustments, timing calibrations, and structural analysis, a complete record of the modification process written in the precise handwriting of someone documenting work for his own reference rather than official review. The museum curator who processed the collection recognized the significance immediately. These were primary source documents proving that a critical tactical innovation had originated not from engineering departments or tactical development programs, but from a single mechanic working unauthorized night shifts. The curator recommended that the logbooks be featured in an exhibition on wartime innovation. The recommendation was declined. The exhibition would focus on officially sanctioned developments. Unauthorized modifications, however successful, did not align with the institutional narrative being presented. The steel remembers what institutions prefer to forget. The P-47 Thunderbolt's effectiveness as a ground attack aircraft is now attributed to design features that were actually field corrections of design flaws. The official history credits systematic innovation, where there was bureaucratic resistance overcome by individual initiative. And Thomas Harwell's contribution exists in the gap between what happened and what was documented, preserved in maintenance logs that no historian reads, in technical bulletins that avoid attribution, and in the private correspondence of men who knew that competence in war is often punished by those whose authority it exposes as inadequate. The modification worked. The institution took credit. The mechanic returned to silence. History documents victories and credits institutions. The steel knows different. It carries the marks of those who actually did the work. In 1978, Thomas Harwell received a letter from the Imperial War Museum requesting permission to interview him for an oral history project documenting the technical contributions of maintenance personnel during World War II. The project coordinator explained that historians had begun recognizing the critical role played by ground crews and mechanics in operational success, a role that official histories had minimized or ignored entirely. Harwell declined the interview, but agreed to submit written responses to a questionnaire. His answers were technically precise and emotionally blank. He described the standard gun convergence configuration, explained the geometric principles behind his adjustment, noted the implementation timeline across fighter groups. When asked how he felt about the modification's impact, he wrote, "It performed as intended." The questionnaire asked him to elaborate. He did not respond to further correspondence. What the questionnaire did not ask, and what Harwell would not have answered, was how a man lives with the knowledge that his technical skill had been optimized for killing. The pilots flew missions and returned to base. The commanders issued orders and reviewed reports, but the mechanics maintained the machinery that made the killing possible, and they did so with a level of intimate knowledge that created a different kind of moral burden. Harwell knew every component of the gun system he had modified. He understood the metallurgy of the barrels, the ballistics of armor-piercing rounds, the physics of penetration and fragmentation. He could calculate exactly what his adjustment would do to a tank crew when concentrated fire breached their armor. The pilot saw results. The mechanic understood mechanism, and understanding mechanism meant accepting responsibility that others could distribute across the chain of command. The nightmares began in 1952 and continued intermittently for the rest of his life. They were not dramatic, no explosions or combat imagery, just the repetitive dream of adjusting gun mounts while knowing exactly what those adjustments would accomplish. In the dreams, he tried to measure different angles, to create convergence patterns that would be less effective, to introduce errors that would reduce accuracy. But his hands moved with the muscle memory of decades, making the adjustments with automatic precision that his conscious mind could not override. He would wake in darkness, hands still mimicking the motion of calibrating firing mechanisms, and lie awake until morning thinking about boys who had burned in tanks while he had slept in England, proud of his technical competence. Catherine understood without being told. She recognized the particular silence of men who carried wartime knowledge they could not share, because articulating it would require admitting things that peacetime society preferred to ignore. She never pressed him to speak about it. She simply maintained the domestic architecture that allowed him to function. Routine, work, family, the small rituals that created distance between past and present. When their son asked why his father sometimes stared at his hands with an expression that looked like grief, Catherine said that war changed people in ways that couldn't be explained. It was the truth, if not the whole truth. The whole truth was that Thomas Harwell had made a technical improvement that worked exactly as designed, and the measure of its success was quantified in destroyed vehicles and men who had died more efficiently because of his competence. The moral weight was not about regret. Harwell never expressed doubt that the war needed to be fought or that Allied victory was necessary. The burden was simpler and more profound. He had been very good at something that should not have required expertise. Optimizing killing through geometric precision, increasing battlefield efficiency through mechanical adjustment, making death more accurate. These were not skills that peacetime society valued or even acknowledged. They were capabilities that revealed uncomfortable truths about what humans could become when institutional necessity aligned with technical competence. The modification had saved Allied lives by taking enemy lives more effectively. That was the logic of war. But logic did not explain why he still felt the weight of the wrench in his hand or heard the sound of gun mounts being calibrated in the silence before sleep. In 1980, a former P-47 pilot named Robert Chen published a memoir that included a chapter on the importance of maintenance crew contributions to combat effectiveness. Chen had flown with the 56th Fighter Group and had been one of the pilots who flew missions with Harwell's modified aircraft. The chapter described the mechanic's unauthorized adjustment and its tactical impact with gratitude and technical detail. Chen sent Harwell an advance copy with a personal note thanking him for work that had saved countless lives. Harwell read the chapter once and wrote back, "You're welcome, it was just mechanical work." Chen understood what the response meant. Some gratitude cannot be accepted because accepting it requires acknowledging what was done to earn it. The modification had made Chen more effective at killing. Chen was grateful. Harwell lived with what that gratitude implied. The final years brought a kind of peace that was less resolution than exhaustion. Harwell retired from the factory in 1979, spent his days in the garden, and spoke less frequently about anything. When asked about his wartime service, he would mention adjusting aircraft systems and leave it at that. The technical competence remained. He could still describe gun convergence calculations from memory, still recognize the sound of properly calibrated firing mechanisms when old combat footage played on television. But the pride that had once accompanied that competence had been replaced by something harder to name. Not shame exactly. More like the quiet recognition that skill is morally neutral, but its applications never are, and that living with what one has done requires accepting that good intentions and terrible outcomes can coexist in the same set of hands. The steel carried what the man could not speak about. Every adjusted gun mount, every calibrated mechanism, every life that ended with precision he had enabled. This was the burden that competence created when applied to war, knowing exactly what you had made possible. Thomas Harwell died on November 3, 1982, at the age of 73, from complications related to emphysema, a condition developed from decades of working in unventilated workshops, breathing metal dust and solvent vapors. His obituary in the Manchester Evening Chronicle ran 4 sentences and mentioned his wartime service in generic terms. Mr. Harwell served with distinction as an aircraft mechanic with the Royal Air Force during World War II, contributing to maintenance operations in the European theatre. There was no mention of modifications, no reference to ground attack effectiveness, no acknowledgement that his unauthorized work had changed tactical doctrine and killed efficiently. The institutional silence that had characterized official recognition of his contribution extended to his death. The mechanic who had corrected what engineers missed was remembered as competent but unremarkable, exactly the kind of documentation that men like Harwell had learned to expect. The P-47 Thunderbolts that Harwell modified were gradually retired from service between 1945 and 1955, replaced by jet aircraft that made piston engine fighters obsolete. Some were sold to foreign air forces. Others were scrapped for aluminum and steel. A few were preserved in museums, their gun mounts still carrying the 3-degree downward cant that Harwell had introduced in a cold English hangar in March 1944. Museum curators who maintained these aircraft occasionally noticed the modification when performing detailed inspections, but without documentation explaining its origin or purpose, they recorded it as manufacturing variation or field repair. The physical evidence of Harwell's work survived, but the context that gave it meaning had been lost. The steel remembered, but no one asked what it remembered or why. In 1998, a defense technology historian named Patricia Donnelly was researching the development of ground attack tactics when she discovered discrepancies in ammunition expenditure rates across P-47 squadrons during 1944. Squadrons based at certain airfields showed significantly higher efficiency, fewer rounds required per disabled target, beginning in May 1944 and continuing through the end of the war. The official record attributed this to improved pilot training, but the timeline didn't align. The efficiency improvements appeared too suddenly and remained too consistent to be explained by gradual skill development. Donnelly began cross-referencing maintenance logs, technical bulletins, and squadron assignments. The pattern that emerged pointed to specific maintenance crews and unauthorized modifications that had spread through informal networks. She eventually identified Thomas Harwell through references in personal letters donated to the Imperial War Museum archives. Donnelly attempted to publish her findings in the Journal of Military History. The paper was rejected. The peer reviewers noted that while her research was thorough, the conclusion that critical tactical innovations had originated from unauthorized field modifications by non-commissioned personnel seemed to undermine confidence in institutional oversight and technical validation procedures. One reviewer suggested that the efficiency improvements were more likely due to undocumented tactical refinements rather than mechanical changes that official engineering reviews had not approved. The paper was never published. Donnelly's research exists in her personal files and in a PhD dissertation that 3 people have read. The institutional resistance that Harwell encountered during the war extended into historical scholarship 60 years later. Some truths remain inconvenient regardless of documentation. The legacy of Harwell's work exists not in official histories, but in the practical knowledge of those who maintain combat aircraft. Modern armorers and weapon system technicians learn convergence adjustment as part of their training, though few know the origin of techniques that seem self-evident. The principle that Harwell discovered, that optimizing accuracy for ground targets requires different geometric calculations than air-to-air engagement, is now embedded in fire control systems and targeting software. The innovation has been absorbed into standard practice, its revolutionary nature forgotten because it now seems obvious. This is how technical knowledge evolves. Unauthorized corrections become accepted procedure, and the people who made those corrections disappear from the record because acknowledging them would require admitting that institutions failed until individuals intervened. Michael Harwell, Thomas's son, donated his father's logbooks and personal correspondence to the Royal Air Force Museum in 1995, 13 years after his father's death. The collection included detailed technical notes on gun convergence modifications, letters from grateful pilots, and maintenance logs documenting the systematic implementation of adjustments across multiple squadrons. The museum accepted the donation but did not create a special exhibition. The materials were catalogued as part of the General Wartime Maintenance Collection and stored in climate-controlled archives where researchers could access them by appointment. In 27 years, 14 people have requested to examine the documents. None were military historians. Most were aircraft restoration specialists looking for technical details to guide museum aircraft maintenance. The story remained untold because the people who knew where to look weren't interested in the human dimension, and the people interested in human stories didn't know the documents existed. What remains is the steel itself, the surviving P-47 Thunderbolts preserved in museums and private collections, their gun mounts still carrying modifications that most observers never notice. The aircraft are maintained to historical accuracy, which means preserving field modifications that docents and restoration specialists assume were part of original manufacture. Visitors photograph the aircraft, read plaques describing their combat record, and learn about pilots who flew them with distinction. No plaques mention Thomas Harwell. No descriptions explain that the aircraft's effectiveness required correction of design flaws by a mechanic working without authorization. The history is accurate in every detail except the ones that matter. The gap between what was designed and what actually worked, between institutional narrative and mechanical truth. In 2019, a restored P-47 at the National Museum of the United States Air Force underwent detailed inspection before being moved to a new display. The inspection revealed gun mount modifications that didn't match original Republic aviation specifications. The restoration team documented the differences and researched their origin. They found references in maintenance logs to field adjustments for ground attack optimization, but no attribution or technical explanation. They decided to preserve the modifications as historically significant evidence of field maintenance practices. The interpretive materials accompanying the display mention that aircraft underwent field modifications to enhance combat effectiveness without explaining what those modifications were or who made them. The steel carries the truth. The institution presents a version of truth that doesn't threaten authorized narratives. Thomas Harwell never sought recognition because he understood that what he had done was both necessary and terrible. A technical correction that made killing more efficient. The modification worked. Thousands of sorties were flown with configurations he developed. Hundreds of enemy vehicles were destroyed with accuracy his adjustments enabled. Allied soldiers survived because air support became more effective. German soldiers died because precision increased. These are facts that coexist without resolving into simple judgment. The war required efficiency. His hands delivered it. And the steel, which knows only the shape it was given and the purpose it served, carries no moral weight because metal cannot distinguish between competence and crime, between technical excellence and the systematic destruction it enables. The war ended. The steel remained. And in the silence between what was done and what was documented, the truth survived in the only place it could, in the gap between authorized history and the marks left on metal by those who actually did the work. The adjustment was never officially approved. It was simply used until it became doctrine. This is how war functions. This is what the steel remembers. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following Thomas Harwell's story. See you in the next video.